So this is the Introducing Collections talk. This is one of our regular events that Outside In runs, in which we ask a collections manager or a curator to talk about their collection, how it came about, and a couple of key pieces from the collection. This talk will hear from Jenny Noble at the Glasgow Women's Library. The Women's Library is a unique resource in Scotland, housing a huge collection of materials by, for, and about women. A multi-award-winning accredited museum, lending library and archive, the library holds a rich and diverse collection of books, artefacts, and archives exemplifying the lives of women, charting their historical and contemporary achievements and contributions, all donated by users, supporters, members, and publishers. So if you're happy, Jenny, I'll hand over to you now to tell us a bit more about the collection.
Great, thank you. So I'll just share my screen again. Okay, well, thanks very much for having me. Hello, everybody, and it's really nice to see a couple of familiar names in the audience. So as Charlotte said, my name's Jenny, and I'm the museum curator at Glasgow Women's Library. And also, as Charlotte said in her introduction, Glasgow Women's Library is maybe a little bit of a misnomer. We are certainly based in Glasgow in the East End, but our collections spread much further afield across the UK, and we have a lot of international connections as well. And we are, of course, more than a library. As Charlotte said, we're an accredited museum and archive as well, with a huge programme of events and learning opportunities. So I'd like to start just with a wee bit about the library's history, just to let you know how it all came about.
Yeah,
can everybody hear me okay?
Because, I spoke to Julie. Julie just got the paper and she said no.
If I could
just remind you, so I'm just looking to see who it might be.
But we just put them in there because it was just easier to.
I helped. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry about that, Jenny.
That's okay. I'm just trying to move my slides on and they're not doing it. I wonder if there's a reason for that. There we go. So the Women's Library had a predecessor, Women in Profile. That came about in the late 80s when Glasgow was preparing its application to be the European City of Culture in 1990. And as exciting as that was, with lots of great people involved, oh, now it's going on automatically. Sorry, is there a way I can stop that happening? It's not meant to be moving on automatically.
I think if you click the backwards arrow, it should be.
Yeah, okay.
So
yeah, the application, it was exciting, but it was very, as one of our co-founders says, pale, male and stale. So it was male orientated. Women were really not represented at all. And within that, you know, women of colour, queer women, disabled women, there was just really nothing to represent at least half of the city. So Women in Profile was a collective of women artists and writers who got together to form a counter programme during the City of Culture year. So Castlemilk Women House was a huge project that came about with support of Women in Profile. It was artist-led. Julie Roberts, Rachel Harris and Cathy Wilkes were three of the main artists involved. The name is taken from Judy Chicago's LA Women House. But this project worked, sorry, I'm just going to have to keep going backwards here. This project worked with the people of Castlemilk. So Castlemilk was a new community set up in Glasgow when the people were sort of cleared from the inner city and moved to new housing. It's very much a working class housing estate and it had very few amenities. So it was really important to be working in this area sort of with deprivation and marginalisation. So the women basically took over a tenement building in Castlemilk, and they organised a whole series of events working with the community to develop a programme that they were deeply involved in. So it was a really important project, and it it launched the careers or developed the careers of quite a number of artists in Glasgow, some of whom were already established and some of whom, became more established through this project. And it was also hugely important in the development of Glasgow Women's Library itself. So with these projects happening, it became very clear that there was a need for somewhere that represented women artists and creatives' work. At first, it was about the programme of events, but a lot of women clearly wanted their work archived in some way, their work preserved. So Glasgow Women's Library was born in 1991, and it was very much a grassroots organisation. It started life in the back room of a shop in Garnet Hill near the City Art School, and most of the founding members were linked to the art school. So it's very much an arts-based grassroots organisation. And for the first 10 years, it was completely run by volunteers. There was no funding in that climate. This type of project just wasn't something that was being funded. So it was working against the tide. And it was 10 years, in fact, before the first funded projects were established and slowly staff were employed. So some of the early projects were particularly focused on adult literacy and numeracy. And also in the early years, there was a community garden. So it was all about, from the start, rather than talking about sort of, as Adele says, hard to reach audiences, the focus really was those hard to reach audiences were making this happen. So it was kind of the opposite way around from a lot of traditional museum and galleries. And as the programme and the collections started to grow, relocation was essential. So the library's actually been to several premises throughout the city, including 2 in the Trongate, a brief spell in the Mitchell Library, where it was planned to stay for a while at one point, but again, the collections and the programme just outgrew that premises. So it was necessary to find a permanent home of our own. So as Glasgow geared up to host the Commonwealth Games in 2014, Clyde Gateway was looking to regenerate the east end of the city. And Glasgow Life, who run most of Glasgow's libraries and museums, they identified the former public library in Bridgeton as a possible location for GWL to move into. So money was raised with the support of Clyde Gateway, and the building, which is a listed Carnegie library, was renovated to make it fit for the library's purpose. So the relocation to 23 Landrecy Street in Bridgeton in the East End, that happened in 2013, but the work wasn't fully completed until November 2015. So it was a really big project, and it was important to make the building as suitable as possible for all the collections and the activities that are run by the library. And the new part of the building was officially opened by Nicola Sturgeon, who was then the First Minister of Scotland, who declared it truly a national treasure. So a wee bit about who we are before we move on to the collections themselves. I think it's important to note that the library has always operated on a system of core values. So these are empowerment, addressing inequalities, valuing all women, learning and development, diversity and inclusivity, and openness and respect. So these are the values that govern all aspects of the library's work, from governance and leadership through to recruitment, how we work with our audiences, how we develop our programmes and our collections, and also how we communicate. So that is kind of a very brief whirlwind introduction to how the library came about. So I'll now introduce you a bit more to the collections themselves. So as I mentioned at the start, as well as being a lending and reference library, GWL holds these archives, and from, I think, 2014, became a recognised collection of national significance in Scotland, as well as being the only accredited museum in the entire UK that is dedicated to women's history. So there are, of course, other museums, galleries, institutions who, who do explore women's history in lots of ways. We are the only accredited museum still, which is quite shocking in some ways. So the archives, to start with those, we kind of think of them as being split into 3 key components. So first of all, we have our own archives, our organisational records that date back to Women in Profile, and taking in projects like Castle Milk Women House, and then continuing all the way through our programmes and our development to the current day. And we turned 30 just a couple of years ago, and as part of that, we had a large funded project in order to catalogue part of our own archival collection to make them more accessible, but also to look back on all the work that had been done in the past and to look at, what was still important now, what was being developed, what had changed, with a view to continuing to be change makers in the future. So that's probably, I don't know, maybe a fifth of our holdings, maybe a bit less, but it is an important part of our archives. The donated archives, the whole collection is donated. So this is just an easy way to explain, to differentiate between the different archives that we hold. But the donated archives are from different groups, institutions and individuals from the Glasgow area, from across Scotland, from the UK, and as I mentioned, a few international links as well. And I'll come back in more detail to those shortly. And the Lesbian Archive, which is probably almost a quarter of our holdings. The Lesbian Archive and Information Centre actually began its life in London. It was London-centric, but not exclusively London-based. And it was a hugely important archive that preserved the work and the stories of lesbians and other queer people, lots of whom were working as activists, so housing activists, social justice activists, and so on. It was a really important project, but as I mentioned earlier, the climate in the late 80s, early 90s was not really about supporting these types of organisations. Under the Thatcher government, funding was really difficult to either obtain in the first place or to secure, and the Lesbian Archive lost their funding and their premises as a result. So the archive had to be rehoused. They did look at, I believe, a few different institutions, including university archives. But in the end, the Lesbian Archive was transferred completely to Glasgow. Now, considering this is a time when the library had no professional staff, certainly no museum and archive staff, I think it says a lot about the way the Women's Library works, that the focus was on sort of the sensitivity and respect around lesbian archives and the need for access to those collections. So I'll come back in a moment to those as well. So our own archive, these include lots of records about our work, but also publicity material, some of which has been created in-house, and as our budget and our staff grew, sometimes we've been able to afford designers as well. I think the early stuff was really important in showing how a grassroots organisation used its limited resources in the most resourceful ways imaginable to communicate, to fundraise, and so on through, like these homemade posters like you can see in the centre there. Lots of, photocopying, creative design, like fundraisers that involved, dressing up and we all drink. So yeah, a really amazing programme of grassroots events. And then as our history progresses, we've obviously got our newsletters and our programmes and so on. So there's a lot to explore in that, our own archive. And go back to the Lesbian Archive. It's really one of the biggest and most significant queer archives in the UK. The material dates back to the 20s. But like most of our collections, it's heavily centred sort of from the 70s onwards. One of the biggest collections in it is the Camden Lesbian Centre and Black Lesbian Group. So there's, you know, a lot about intersectional feminism, excuse me, intersectional feminism in there. Lots of people of colour who've been involved in different forms of activism. So there's so much great stuff to access in that archive. And a lot of that has been catalogued. We've worked with various PhD researchers who have then written blog posts. So there's a lot to explore on our website about that collection alone. There's other things like the Lesbians and Policing Project, and then LIPS, which was actually GWL's first funded project, Lesbians and Peer Support, which led to the sort of first job creation at the library. And we have got a lot of rare LGBTQ plus publications like Sappho, Urania, The Ladder, Arena 3, and then more contemporary publications like Diva, Glasgow, and so on. We also represent some individual activists like Jackie Forster. So again, there's just a huge amount of material in there. Some of it is catalogued and some of it is still to be done, but there is a wealth of information on the website to explore. And then go back to the donated archives, there's a real mix in there. So I've highlighted some of the key collections that we hold. These are around sort of, you know, feminism in its broadest sense, and equality. So Close the Gap and the Equal Opportunities Commission, looking at sort of work-related issues, also the Engender Archive. We have got the Family Planning Archive and Scottish Abortion Campaign here. We've recently accepted the Radical Midwives Association archives. The Josephine Butler Society, that's a really interesting one. Josephine was working at the turn of the last century, so sort of across the 1900s, working to improve legal and health conditions for sex workers in Edinburgh and beyond. The Meridian Archive. The Meridian was a centre in Glasgow which worked specifically with women of colour, and it no longer exists, but the archive is a great resource looking at the cultural history of women of colour in Glasgow. We've got a lot on campaigns against violence against women, including the Scottish Women's Aid Archive and Zero Tolerance campaign. And we've recently taken on a large donation from Dobash and Dobash, who have done a lot of work in this field. And of course, feminist materials, and like honing in specifically, we've got a lot of women's liberation newsletters and material relating to women's lib groups. So again, most of these archives are focused sort of on the 70s and 80s going forward, but we do have some older material as well. And in the museum collection, the women's suffrage collection is probably our largest, oldest collection. It dates back to the 1890s to the 1920s. So we've got, you know, original pamphlets, postcards, both pro and anti-suffrage. We've got copies of Just Suffragette Journal. And then on top of that, we've got this amazing collection of, you know, artworks, largely contemporary. We've got hundreds and hundreds of badges belonging to women, banners and placards, girls' annuals, knitting and needlework. So it's a real mix of activist materials, but also some sort of more everyday materials relating to women's lives. The museum collection also takes in books from the library that have been weeded. So the library operates like any lending library and is regularly updated to make sure that it's, you know, it is up to date, that the material there is significant. But there's so many rare books and important books in the library that they're not disposed of. A lot of them will then be added to the museum collections so that they're preserved for the future. So we've got a lot of women's fiction, poetry and non-fiction in the museum collection as well. And a wee shout out to the National Museum of Roller Derby, which was actually created by an artist that we worked with. And yeah, it's a really exciting collection representing the roller derby leagues from across the UK and some internationally as well. So a little introduction to the art collection itself. It's a mixture of fine art, some photographs, sort of design and contemporary artworks, a wee bit of sculpture and patisserie art as well. So these are some of the key collections that we hold. And what I'd like to do next is just introduce you a wee bit more to some of the specific art projects that we've worked on. A key thing about the library's collections, as well as the fact that almost everything is donated, is that it's very much about access and using the collections organically. So we tend to engage in a lot of collaborations with creatives, whether that is writers, visual artists, anyone creative. And often the artist will be inspired by what's already in the archives, and then they will create new work in response to that or reimagine it or whatever. So I'd like to take you through just a few of those projects now. So 21 Revolutions, that was a major project to celebrate Glasgow Women's Library's 21st birthday. So 21 writers and 21 artists, all women, were commissioned to create new work in response to the library archive and museum artefacts. So this was, it was a really exciting project. I wasn't in the library at the time that this happened, but it's a really big part of our work today. Some of the works are on display, some of them go out on loan frequently. It was a really amazing project. The Museum of Roller Derby actually came about through this. Most of the artists created screen prints, but Ellie Harrison was very into roller derby at the time and felt that there was a need for a specific archive on roller derby, which didn't exist. So she kind of managed to found the National Museum of Roller Derby, which is just a small part of our collections. But alongside that, we have got prints by Kira Phillips. We've got sort of a paper installation by Carla Black. Lots and lots of different material, some of which was inspired by the suffrage collections, as you can see on the cover of our publication, which we still sell in the shop. And also working with writers like A.L. Kennedy, Jackie Kay, many, many more. And these works are available on the website as podcasts. So that's 21 Revolutions, and you should be able to find out more if you use the QR codes that are coming up. You should be able to scan those on your phones if you want to find out a bit more about the projects just now. So life support was a big project that happened kind of during the pandemic, so it was interesting in that regard. I wasn't actually involved with it at all, I should say that now. I was off sick for a long time with long COVID, but this was a really important project that was done in partnership with various curators in the University of St Andrews. As I've put on the screen here, it looked at how artists and other creatives have looked at some of the challenges around women's issues like health, education, housing, and other forms of care. It used material from our archives and beyond, and created displays and installations that were throughout the building, focusing on feminist, queer, and anti-racist responses to existing systems of care or the lack of them. So we had work by, for example, Veronica Ryan. You can see Coco Passion at the bottom of the page there. Videos by Alberta Whittle. We worked with material by Greer Langton, including having a beautiful flag at the side of our building. Kate Davis, Manual Labours, who were a sort of a duo, and Martha Rosler. And I think because it happened during the pandemic, or the height of the pandemic, it's obviously kind of still with us, but it was very timely in highlighting the need for these systems of support. I'd like to focus in particular on the project by Olivia Plender. So Olivia is a multidisciplinary artist. She's very interested in forms of care through collaboration and feminism. So she explored the health materials in our archive, and she was particularly interested in the book Our Bodies, Ourselves, created by the Boston Health Book Collective in the 1970s. It was very much based on the concept of consciousness raising and using that technique to explore women's healthcare and looking at the ways in which women are often not considered when it comes to healthcare, that a lot of the testing models are done solely on men, and within that, you know, women of colour were not being recognised, queer bodies, disabled bodies, and so on. So Olivia is very interested in exploring those themes. And as the main part of her project, she redesigned our community room. So the community room was originally the girls and boys reading room in Bridgeton Public Library. And we had been using it as a meeting space, both internally and for venue hires, seminars, and so on. It's a decent sized room, but it just wasn't a very friendly space to be in. The walls were quite an uncomfortable kind of orangey colour. There was very harsh strip lighting, and you know, it was a big space that did tend to be used a little bit as a dumping ground as well. So it was always, you know, a challenge when we were hosting groups. So Olivia redesigned the space with comfort and care in mind. So the walls and the ceiling have been repainted. The colour is Lavender Menace. So it brings to mind suffragette activism. And I think also it was in response to sort of comments on feminism that were not particularly complimentary in the 1970s, the Lavender Menace. It also complements the carpet, which I don't know how well you can see that, but the repeating design is of what we call the umbrella. It's a bandstand just round the corner from us at Bridgeton Cross. And the carpet itself was one of the last to be made in Templeton's Carpet Factory, which was obviously a huge centre for design in Glasgow, and is just a few streets away from the building itself, is still just a few streets away from the library. Olivia also introduced sort of softer furnishings, so these globe lights, the round rugs on the floor, and bean bags, which yeah, I've had to use myself at times, and it's been such a godsend. The curtain that you can hopefully just see in the background, that features the women who were involved in translating Our Bodies, Ourselves. So I don't know how much you know about the book, but it kind of took on a life of its own after it was first published. And women in different areas and different countries looked at the book and said, well, this is great, but it doesn't represent us. So the translated versions included a lot of new material that then represented different women and different bodies. So there are lots of women's voices represented within that one book and its various iterations. And this room became actually the focus for a follow-up project that Olivia did, which I was involved in myself, working with a small group of women with chronic illnesses to reimagine, in the vein of Our Bodies, Ourselves, what healthcare could look like and what the current challenges are. So it was a really lovely space to be in, and it's just, I think it's a great example of how the artwork can be very practical. It's not just about adding things to our archives, but it's about comfort around us and in the ways that we work and we live our lives. Another project that happened around the time of the pandemic was with Ingrid Pollard. So Ingrid is a multimedia artist and particularly interested in photographic processes. Ingrid was very active in London in the 80s, so some of her material actually appears in the Lesbian Archive, sort of printmaking through the Lenthal Road workshop. And So Ingrid was invited to be an artist in residence, and she explored a lot of material in the Lesbian Archive. And the exhibition name, No Cover Up, comes from, it's basically the story of Colin Roach, who was killed in a police cell. So it's an example of police brutality, which happened over 40 years ago now, but it was particularly timely. It was happening just, it was 40 years almost to the day as the Black Lives Matter movement kicked off in the States, with very similar examples of police brutality. So a lot of Ingrid's work was sort of showing how these things can be swept under the carpet for decades, and by not addressing these issues, they are still with us. So it was a hugely important project. She used photographs in the collection to create this beautiful frieze, which was exhibited in the library throughout the time that the exhibition was up. One of the photos, it's the photos show protesters, I think in London, but in one picture in particular, the people, the subjects of the photo are they're there protesting, but they're very relaxed. And actually they knew Ingrid, and they were smiling at her as someone they knew, as well as a photographer. So it's a really beautiful image. Ingrid also worked with participants from the community to develop some other materials. I think I've got these on the next page. Yes, so she worked with some women to select some books from the library that were no longer in circulation, and they sort of reimagined them, you know, thinking about if you opened up these books and you found little messages or care packages inside them. So, you know, one of the books has got a little pack of drawing materials, one of them has a candle, they've got little words of support and wisdom cut out and pasted across the pages. So that was a really lovely project. And the other one, the little sort of bird box type things that you can hopefully see in the bottom corner of the screen, those are audio boxes, which Ingrid created. She explored some of the activists who'd been involved in the Lesbian Archive in the early days, and then sort of recorded some new interviews with them. And these boxes, so they've got the little audio clips inside them, and they were placed throughout the library on the shelves. So it was very much a participatory project, and at times you could, you know, people would be going around pressing the buttons, and you would hear all these different voices throughout the library, which is just beautiful. And I think it is also an indication of how we're not a sort of traditionally quiet library. There's always stuff going on, and there's always different voices to be heard in there. So these two examples were accessioned into our collections. So that's just an example of how we'll work with an artist to explore what's already there, to really delve deeply into some of those hidden histories, to bring them to life and to into sort of the sunlight, if you like, and also to develop our own collections and address some of the gaps there that might exist. So yeah, we're all about working with artists to identify issues that we feel are really important to today's society, and that would benefit from further exploration. So just to go back to a wee bit more about how we work again, one of my roles is contemporary collecting. So as I said, most of our archives are donated. They tend to come from organisations and individuals who will contact us and they want to specifically donate their archives to the library. But there are times when there are national events or local events happening, and we feel that it's important to represent those in the collections. So then we will put out an appeal and do a rapid response intervention. So some examples from recent years have been the Repeal the 8th campaign. That was obviously in Ireland in order to change the abortion right laws. Some people do ask why an Irish campaign and a Glasgow archive, but of course the point was that for years, decades, Irish women have had to travel to the UK in order to have an abortion safely. And campaigners were actually sending us material from across Ireland, but also specifically from Glasgow, Edinburgh, and other areas where people were supporting the repeal campaign. COP26, of course, was hosted by Glasgow in 2021, so we did manage to collect some material from sort of activists who were involved there. And then most recently, we've taken in a lot of protest placards. We did have some of these in the past, but last year in particular, there was a lot of rallies in Glasgow around abortion rights and trans rights in particular. So we collected a lot of placards around those, and many of those are really artworks in their own right. Some of them are sort of slogans that are scribbled on cardboard, and they are equally important, but there's some really beautiful hand-painted or embroidered works within that collection as well. So how we use our collections. We have exhibitions. So some recent exhibitions that we've put on using our own collections have been Colour in Motion, which explored Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham's work. We have 4 beautiful prints in the collection that you can see in the top corner there, along with a host of postcards and exhibition catalogues, all of which were donated to us by the Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham Trust. So it's wonderful to work in partnership with these organisations to develop our collections and to sort of share more information about artists who are really important but very often underrepresented. Collecting in the time of coronavirus, that really came about because even though the country was in lockdown, we found that we were still receiving donations. I think a lot of people took the opportunity of being off work and at home to do clean outs, basically. So it was a time when we were contacted with lots of material. So it's not necessarily relating to the pandemic, although we do have some face masks, and we have a couple of prints by the broadcaster Bridisha, which she created in lockdown. But there's also material that relates to going, you know, people have gone back years, if not decades, relating to like the peace movement. We received more roller derby material at that time, material relating to Women's Aid. So yeah, it was just an exhibition that kind of highlighted the material that had come to us during the pandemic. And also we put on display sort of written work that had been created by the library's volunteers during the pandemic as a way to, I suppose, a way to boost their mental health and well-being with the support of a volunteer coordinator. So it was really amazing to have these sort of stories and documents of the pandemic in the library while this exhibition was up. And then out in the archive, that was really pulling from the Lesbian Archive and our own work over the last few decades. So yeah, we worked with a researcher who did this amazing job of sort of creating a timeline on the wall and pulling out all these fantastic visual materials from the Lesbian Archive. Open Archive is something that we tend to do every quarter or thereabouts. It's because many of our collections are in storage. Although we're very keen on access to the stored collections, it's obviously nice to get them out in the open. And yeah, we have a lot of exhibitions, but there's only so much you can display at a time. So the Open Archive is a great way to bring out themed collections for a couple of hours. So we quite often will run them on a Thursday evening when we're open late, or on a Saturday, in the hope that people who don't manage midweek can come along. And some of the Open Archives we've done recently have been about Stop the Clause, about Section 28. We did do a roller derby one. That's actually 6 years ago now, and we're planning another one in July. We had a project working with community creators for a while, who were exploring the collections and bringing those to light. So we had a pop-up event led by the community curators, some of whom were local women. And then out in the archive itself, had a sort of an add-on Open Archive where one of our co-directors, Sue John, who was also a lesbian Avenger in Glasgow, gave a talk, and people were able to view some of the materials that we couldn't fit into the display. I think it's important to mention a little bit about our funding. Because of our origins as a grassroots organisation, we've always been sort of short on resources. We're now in the position where we get core funding that tends to run on a 1 to 3 year basis. So we have, like my own position and several others are funded by Creative Scotland. We do get some funding from the Scottish Government and other sources, but a lot of the time we're also relying on grant funding for specific projects, and that will allow us, you know, to do work specific to certain collections, and also to employ extra staff to help with that for certain periods of time. So two projects that were led fairly recently was Lesbian Lives, and that was a partnership between the library and GI, Glasgow International Festival of Visual Arts, which was funded by the Esme Fairbairn's Collections Fund. And so part of that project was about cataloguing the collections. Again, the pandemic kind of kicked in and it made some of that very difficult to complete to the point we'd have liked it to. But there was an online resource created as part of that project. So quite a lot of the material from the Lesbian Archive is available to view on our website. And then, as I mentioned near the start, 3 Decades of Changing Minds was a 2-year project to celebrate our 30th anniversary, to interpret, safeguard and share our own heritage. And our slogan for that was look back to move forward. So it's very much about, as I said, exploring the work that had been done by the library, looking at why that was, why there was a need for it, where there's still a need for that work, and how we can keep developing. We do see ourselves as change makers, but we also are very much aware that that's not something we can do alone. We work in collaboration, and we are always asking questions of ourselves and looking to improve. So who uses our collections? Well, I've listed sort of some of the key groups here, from academic researchers to artists and creatives, artists and residents who do deep delves into the collection, or maybe local history groups who come for a short visit and look at some specific material. We get a lot of inquiries from media and broadcasting groups as well. Often that's at a short notice, so that can be challenging. And we do a lot of work with further education groups, particularly colleges and universities. So we host several placements every year for students to work with the collections, to up their own skills and develop them, and also to help us improve our collections. We work with various women's groups and the staff and volunteers themselves. The collections are hugely important to all of us. And as I mentioned, it's all about access. We are different to other organisations in that it's always been people-centred rather than collection-centred. So the collections, of course, are of huge importance. And as an accredited museum, we do adhere to those accreditation standards. But we also believe that what is the point of preserving collections and artefacts if people aren't able to use them and engage with them? So that's a really important part of our work. And we encourage all of our staff and volunteers to be familiar with and find ways of using the collection. So quite often our staff are part-time, and obviously our volunteers are part-time. So it may be some of them have their own projects and they will work with our collections to develop those. We nod it to our volunteers. At the moment, we've got over 80 of them. They obviously don't take the takeover from paid work, but they are involved in all aspects of the library. So we've got 2 volunteer coordinators who they work with the volunteers to look at what their existing skills are, but where they also want to develop, whether that is specifically to do with, you know, cataloguing in archives, or whether it is more public facing or administrative. And then they'll match the volunteers up to specific roles within the library that will help us out, but will develop the volunteers' skill set as well, or just improve their health and well-being generally through sort of social interactions. So their volunteers are amazing. They do everything from like helping with admin to developing and leading heritage walks across the city, highlighting women who are not otherwise included in the city's history. So yeah, a big shout out to the volunteers. They do so much for us. Of course, we have loans in and out as well of our collections. So it's another great way of sort of improving access. So we were so lucky a couple of years ago to get 5 beautiful Joan Eardley artworks on display from the University of Edinburgh art collections. That was really exciting for us. You know, I mentioned some of the artists that worked on the life support exhibition. So we've had some really exciting loans in, but we also put as much of our material out as we can as well. Another way of creating access. And I've listed some of the more recent loan outs at the side there, and they include the Women in Revolt exhibition that's currently on at the Tate. It's only on for another couple of weeks, I think. So definitely worth seeing if you haven't been already and you're in the area. If not, it will be coming in a changed form to Edinburgh and then to Manchester. So that's a really exciting exhibition to have been involved in. We've also got a couple of our Section 28 placards have gone on long-term display at the V&A in Dundee. And then we also work with smaller community groups as well. If we're loaning out to organisations that don't necessarily have museum standard environmental conditions or display cases, we also have our handling collection, which is made up of original material, but where it's duplicated. So we have material in the core collection, which is preserved, but then we have these spare duplicates in the handling collections, which can be, they're a great representation of the overall collection, and it's just very useful for us to be able to loan them out to community groups and schools and so on and not have to worry about them. So that's loans. And finally, to finish up, we've totally over time here, I'm sorry. Just to say, you can explore our website and find lots of resources online, including blog posts which give great context to the collections. And if you want to work with us, you will find a page, how to get involved and work with GWL, on our website as well. It will, there's some guidelines about how we work with people, what we are looking for, and how we can hopefully work together. So yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't realize it was so late. So I think there's 10 minutes left for questions. So I will finish up there. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, I'd be more than happy to try and answer them.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That was so interesting, and yeah, I definitely have lots of questions following.
Should I stop sharing my screen now?
Yeah, maybe if you stop sharing, and then if anyone has any questions, they can either pop them in the chat or maybe use the raise hand function, or just give me a wave, and I'll try and keep an eye out for anyone who's got a question. In the meantime, I was really interested in what kind of initially drew you to working with the collection, whether there were any particular pieces that kind of stood out to you when you first joined, and if you could tell us a bit more about those.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked in the sector now for 25 years, which is a little frightening. And although I've worked on some material related to women or projects relating to women, I've never really had the chance to immerse myself in women's history because there's not a lot of opportunities like that around. So that was a big part of it for me. And also my undergrad degree was on Scottish literature. So actually working in a building full of books, but with museum and archive collections, was just an incredible opportunity. I also love the fact that we do work to these core values. The first time I visited the library, I felt really warmly welcomed, which is something that the library does aim to do. So it's a combination of all those things that made me want to work at the library in the first place. I mean, I love all the collections. It's really hard to pick anything out, but I guess the suffrage collection is one that's really significant and hugely important. And we do actually have a display on just now. We Deserve a Medal, which explores militant suffrage activity. That came about because I don't know how many of you will be aware, but our first major purchased acquisition happened towards the end of last year when Maud Joachim's Hunger Strike medal came up for auction. So we very quickly managed to obtain a National Fund for Acquisitions grant, and then our communications officer did this amazing crowdfunding campaign in order to source the funds that were needed to acquire the medal. So that's on display alongside 2 other hunger strike medals belonging to 2 Glasgow sisters, Margaret and Frances McFun, whose family heard about Maud Joachim's medal coming to the library, and they wanted to highlight the McFun sisters' history as well. So we have them on loan as well. So it's really exciting to see that collection, out of the stores and on display, and it's definitely one that I love working with.
That's awesome, thank you. So I can see a question from Becky in the chat, who was just asking, do you have anything of particular interest to outsider artists' arts? And kind of maybe related to that, I was wondering about the sort of placard art that you were talking about and protest art, whether you'd consider that outsider art possibly.
Yeah, I'm not sure about how you would define the term outsider art. I mean, I guess a lot of our collections are what would traditionally be sort of outsiders, that's marginalized communities and people, is at the heart of our collections, and activists form a big part of that. So I mean, yeah, definitely I would consider a lot of the art, the placards to be, part of our art collection as well as activism. And I think it's collections that speak up for marginalized people, and not just speak up for them, but it's the marginalized people themselves who are centered in that, and having a chance to speak. So any art that represents people who are not represented normally in the mainstream is really important. So many people will walk into a museum or gallery space and not see themselves represented in any way. So all of our art is really about making sure that those artists and creatives, have a voice. I'm not really sure if that answers the question though.
Yeah, I mean, obviously outsider art is such a huge term and it means something different to everybody. But yeah, I don't know if Becky, if you wanted to add anything to that, or whether that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, sorry, I'm having trouble working out my phone.
I think you might have just cut out slightly.
First of all, it's inspiring.
Sorry, I couldn't hear the rest of the question there. I think it cut out. I don't know whether that was for anyone else.
It's not a question what I'm saying. I'm inspired that you keep art after a project that's been completed. But in terms of outside in, I think I'm not entirely sure, and I haven't thought this through, but I think there's a lot of marginalized people, but there's then self-taught artists. And one question would be, when you mentioned that you have artists in residence, do you consider self-taught artists to run projects, or do they have to have degrees and masters to be considered to be artists?
Oh goodness, no. Anyone who's an art practitioner in any form, so long as the values relate to the Women's Library and the project fits the work that we are aiming to do, we're not about excluding people because of barriers that are set up through education or otherwise. Definitely not.
Right. That's a major difference from a lot of institutions then. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
It's always great to hear. So there's another question from Jenny, which you may have slightly answered a little bit already, but if you wanted to add anything extra to, it's about saying how brilliant it is to hear about your collections, but do you have a favourite item in the collection and why? I don't know whether you wanted to add anything extra to that.
Yeah, I always find this impossible to answer because every day I've got a different favourite item. So I mean, at the moment, I guess Maud Joachim's medal is right up there because it's just so beautiful, tiny, it says so much. So many stories are linked into that. So that's my current favourite. I'm also, I'm really fond of the National Museum of Roller Derby as well, because it was a sport that I was new to when I started at the library. So the collection has taught me about that, and I think it's a really beautiful example of sport that can be inclusive and queer friendly and joyous, which is what the Women's Library is all about. So yeah, I think, yeah, for now, that's my favourites.
Brilliant. There's another question from Andrea asking or saying that they've been to the Goldsmiths Women Art Library and asking whether you're connected to them and how does your collection differ from theirs. I don't know if you know their collection.
Well, I have to confess, yet we're not connected to them, and I haven't visited myself, so I'm not familiar with their collections. We do work in collaboration with a lot of other women's organisations. It tends to be sort of feminist organisations who are striking out in areas where these haven't traditionally existed. So, you know, we work with Bookbunk in Nairobi, Kenya. We've been working with OD Library in Finland. Our Dell's recently back from Istanbul. So we tend to work with these sort of feminist organisations. And yeah, we do like, you know, work with established institutions in terms of loans and some projects. But yeah, I'm really sorry, I'm not familiar with that particular collection, so I can't say.
That's okay. I can see Claire has her hand up, so if you wanted to ask your question, Claire.
Oh yeah, it was just thank you. It was really good to see. I didn't realise about your connection with Hannah Frank, and I've just I think I mentioned to you when we met earlier that my mum's from Glasgow, and she's passed me down a Hannah Frank print, which is I've just gone a bit Antiques Roadshow and got it down.
Oh, nice.
So I just I don't know that much about her, but I was just thinking I have to come and visit and find out more now that I know that you've got her work in your collection.
Yeah, those collections, those prints are online, and there's also a great Hannah Frank website itself. They are the 21 prints that we have were gifted to the library by the Hannah Frank Foundation. And actually, two, I think, of the prints were recently on display at the Dovecot Libraries for their exhibition celebrating 200 years of women artists. But yeah, of course, Hannah had all these connections with Glasgow University and so on. And she's represented, I think, on the Garnet Hill Women's Heritage Walk as well. So yeah, definitely some more to learn there.
Brilliant. Thanks for telling me more.
So I can't see any other questions in the chat. There are a couple of comments saying thank you for the interesting talk and I hope to come and visit soon. So I think everyone really appreciated the talk and thank you so much for sharing with us more information about the collection as a whole. Maybe if people have any other further questions, I can forward them on to you. But
yeah, and people are very welcome to get in touch by email as well. And if they've got any questions, I know it's sometimes hard to think of things at the time. So yeah, if anything comes up later, then please do get in touch. It's been a pleasure to be here today. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing with us and hope everyone has good afternoons. Take care. Bye.